I remember
The
my
morning began
grandfather
without
telling me
warning
about the
signs,
strikes
and
back
that
in the
was what made
30s.
it dangerous.
It wasn't
The
just
sky
about
above
wages,
Chicago's
it was
south
about
side was
dignity.
clear, almost indifferent, as families gathered near the open field not far from the Republic Steel plant. It was Memorial Day, a holiday meant for remembrance, but for the people arriving that morning, it symbolized something else entirely. They came carrying belief instead of weapons, conviction instead of protection. Men adjusted worn jackets, women smoothed children's hair, and conversations floated between hope and unease. The steel mills loomed nearby, their presence constant, their power unquestioned. Years of exhaustion had led to this moment, a peaceful march meant to say what words alone had failed to accomplish. No one expected applause, but few expected death. The crowd did not chant loudly. They walked with restraint, believing calm would be enough. That belief would become the most fragile thing they carried. Most of the men had spent their lives inside heat and noise, working steel that shaped the nation while breaking their bodies in return. Their wages barely matched the risk, and injuries were treated as inconveniences rather than human losses. Attempts to unionize had been crushed quietly for years, meetings broken up, leaders fired, fear reinforced. Still, something had shifted. The country was changing. Labor movements were gaining ground elsewhere, and word traveled faster than companies could silence it. This march was not reckless, it was calculated. Organizers emphasized discipline, reminding everyone that violence would only discredit them. Hands visible, voices calm, families present. The presence of children was intentional, meant to show humanity rather than aggression. They believed that visibility would act as armor. They believed that if enough witnesses existed, restraint would be guaranteed. History had not prepared them for what happens when power feels exposed. Ahead of them, the police line waited. It was not large, but it was deliberate. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, batons ready, guns holstered but visible. Their faces revealed nothing, trained neutrality masking private thoughts. Orders had already been given behind closed doors, though the crowd did not know their content. Officially, the police were there to maintain order. Unofficially, their role had always been clear in labor disputes. They protected property, not people. The distance between the marchers and the officers felt symbolic, a narrow stretch of ground separating authority from desperation. As the crowd approached, footsteps slowed. Some men glanced at their children, second-guessing decisions already made. Still, they continued forward. Retreat would mean surrender. Progress, even slow progress, felt necessary. Silence pressed down on the field, the kind that exists only when something irreversible is approaching. A white flag appeared near the front of the march, raised carefully, deliberately. It was not an act of weakness, but communication. Peace. Intention. Restraint. The organizers believed symbols still mattered. The crowd followed behind it, steady and quiet. Songs faded into murmurs. Wind brushed across the grass, lifting hems and carrying dust. The police line did not respond. No acknowledgement, no signal of compromise. Instead, a command was shouted, sharp, clipped, authoritative. Most could not hear the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. Stop. Turn back. The front of the march hesitated. Confusion rippled backward. Some believed negotiations would begin. Others sensed danger but could not explain why. The white flag remained raised. For a moment, everything balanced on restraint. Then restraint broke. The gunfire did not begin with a warning. It erupted suddenly, violently, tearing through the quiet like a betrayal made audible. Shots echoed across the field, overlapping, relentless. People froze before panic took over. Children screamed. Adults dropped instinctively, hands still raised, disbelief etched across faces. The white flag fell, fluttering once before touching the ground. Bullets struck bodies, grass, air. Some tried to run, only to realize there was nowhere to go. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out cries for help. The idea that this was happening, here, now, on a holiday, felt impossible, yet it continued. Those who fell did not always fall once. The field transformed from gathering place to killing ground in seconds. Peace had not protected them. It had marked them. When the shooting finally slowed, the violence did not end. Officers moved forward, batons raised, striking men already bleeding, already broken. Some victims tried to crawl away, leaving trails in the grass. Others lay still, unsure whether movement would bring relief or more pain. No immediate medical aid arrived. The police controlled the scene, not to assist, but to dominate it. Cameras were seized. Witnesses were ordered back. The narrative began forming instantly, shaped not by truth but by authority. By evening, headlines would describe a riot, an armed mob, a necessary response. Those who survived would struggle to reconcile what they saw with what they heard reported. The distance between reality and record grew rapidly, threatening to bury the truth beneath official language. The dead were counted quietly. 10 men would never return home. Dozens more were wounded, some permanently. Their names were spoken in hushed tones that night, in kitchens and hospital corridors. Children waited for fathers who would not arrive. Wives sat beside beds listening to machines breathe for men who could no longer do so easily themselves. There was grief, but also confusion. How could a peaceful march end this way? How could the state justify it? The questions echoed unanswered. Authorities moved quickly to frame the event, emphasizing alleged threats, imagined weapons, distorted moments. The workers' voices were excluded. Silence became policy. Accountability dissolved before it could form. When night fell, the story had already begun to change. Newspapers went to print with headlines that did not match the screams still echoing in survivors' ears. Officials described chaos, claimed officers had been attacked, insisted force was unavoidable. The language was careful, almost rehearsed, as if prepared in advance for such a moment. Families gathered around radios, hearing words that turned their dead into aggressors. In hospital corridors, wounded men listened in disbelief as their pain was reframed as guilt. The massacre was being rewritten in real time, and those who controlled the microphones controlled the memory. This was not unusual. History often belongs to whoever speaks first with authority. But something fragile yet powerful existed beyond official statements. Somewhere, a camera had been rolling. Somewhere, truth had been captured without intention, without allegiance. And that unplanned witness would soon fracture the carefully constructed lie. The film surfaced quietly at first, shown in fragments before the full footage reached public view. What it revealed was devastating. Hands were raised. The white flag was visible. There was no charge, no threat, no warning. The gunfire came without justification, and it came from one direction only. Viewers saw men collapse mid-step, saw bodies struck again after they fell. The camera did not flinch, and neither did the truth. For many Americans, this was the first time state violence against workers had been documented so clearly. It stripped away abstraction and replaced it with undeniable reality. The images traveled farther than any testimony ever could. They reached living rooms, courtrooms, and congressional chambers. They forced questions that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. Yet exposure did not equal justice. It only revealed how difficult justice becomes once violence is sanctioned by authority. Hearings were announced with solemn promises of accountability. Officials spoke carefully, balancing outrage with restraint, concern with caution. Survivors testified, their voices steady but their hands trembling as they relived the field, the sound, the disbelief. Lawyers argued technicalities. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. Each decision passed the burden to another office, another committee, another delay. In the end, no officer faced criminal conviction. The system investigated itself and found no fault it was willing to punish. For families, this was the second violence. The first had taken lives. The second erased meaning. Settlements came years later, framed as closure, but they felt transactional, as if grief could be priced and dismissed. The steel companies resumed operations uninterrupted. Production schedules replaced memorial services. Profit recovered faster than trust ever could. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Some lives could be lost without consequence. Time moved forward, but the survivors did not leave the field behind. It followed them into old age, into sleep, into moments of unexpected silence. They remembered details others forgot, the way the grass smelled, the exact moment hope turned to fear, the sound of bullets striking bodies rather than earth. Their stories were not dramatic in the way headlines prefer. They were precise, restrained, and deeply human. Many waited years before speaking publicly, not because they forgot, but because no one asked. When they finally did, it was not to relive trauma, but to prevent erasure. Organizations like the Illinois Labor History Society listened when others had not. They recorded testimonies, preserved documents, and insisted the massacre be named accurately. Memory became resistance. Documentation became defiance against a system that had relied on forgetting. This story does not hinge on uncertainty. There is no mystery about what happened. The question has never been whether the violence occurred, but whether society was willing to confront why. The massacre was not an accident. It was the result of decisions layered over years, decisions to suppress unions, to criminalize dissent, to prioritize economic output over human safety. Each ignored grievance narrowed the space for peaceful resolution. Each dismissal hardened positions until force felt inevitable to those in power. Understanding this does not dilute responsibility. It concentrates it. The field did not erupt spontaneously. It exploded under pressure applied deliberately, persistently, and without empathy. The men who marched were not naive. They were desperate. And desperation, when ignored long enough, becomes dangerous not because of violence from below, but because of violence from above. This story does not hinge on uncertainty. There is no mystery about what happened. The question has never been whether the violence occurred, but whether society was willing to confront why. The massacre was not an accident. It was the result of decisions layered over years, decisions to suppress unions, to criminalize dissent, to prioritize economic output over human safety. Each ignored grievance narrowed the space for peaceful resolution. Each dismissal hardened positions until force felt inevitable to those in power. Understanding this does not dilute responsibility. It concentrates it. The field did not erupt spontaneously. It exploded under pressure applied deliberately, persistently, and without empathy. The men who marched were not naive. They were desperate. And desperation, when ignored long enough, becomes dangerous not because of violence from below, but because of violence from above. Chicago itself struggled with the truth. Some residents demanded reform, seeing the massacre as a stain on the city's identity. Others defended authority, arguing order must be preserved at all costs. Time softened public outrage, as it often does, replacing urgency with distance. New crises arrived. New headlines competed for attention. The field where the shooting occurred changed shape. Roads cut through it. Buildings rose. Ordinary life resumed. To someone passing by years later, it looked unremarkable. But history does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. It settles beneath the surface, waiting. The city carried the massacre quietly, unsure whether to acknowledge it fully or let it fade. That tension became part of Chicago's character, a place built by labor, yet reluctant to confront the price paid by laborious. This retelling does not invent events. It restores weight to moments flattened by time. It reconnects emotion to record, urgency to archive. The massacre has often been reduced to a paragraph in textbooks, stripped of faces and voices. But history is not meant to be sterile. It is meant to be instructive. By fictionalizing perspective without altering fact, this story brings viewers back into uncertainty, into the seconds before gunfire, into the belief that restraint would be enough. Suspense here is not about outcome. We know how it ends. It is about inevitability. About watching preventable violence approach while knowing it will not be stopped. That is where the tension lives. In recognition, not surprise. The men who marched believed visibility was protection. They believed the presence of families would soften authority. They believed the holiday itself carried moral weight. Those beliefs were reasonable. They were also fatal. Power does not always respond to symbolism. Sometimes it interprets it as provocation. The massacre revealed a brutal truth. Restraint is not a shield when control feels threatened. That lesson echoes far beyond 1937. It appears wherever peaceful demands are met with force, wherever authority equates order with obedience. The field became proof that violence does not require chaos. It can arrive fully organized, justified by procedure, executed without hesitation. That realization changed how people understood the state, not as a neutral protector, but as an actor with interests. Memorial Day was intended to honor sacrifice made in distant wars, but in Chicago, it came to mark a sacrifice made at home. The men who died that afternoon were not soldiers, yet they faced authority knowing the risks were real. They marched unarmed, believing that citizenship itself carried protection. Their deaths forced an uncomfortable reckoning, whose sacrifices are publicly mourned and whose are quietly absorbed into history without ceremony. These workers did not die for ideology or conquest, but for recognition, dignity, and the right to be heard without fear. Their loss expanded the meaning of Memorial Day beyond military service, challenging the nation to consider labor as a battleground and economic justice as a form of civic struggle. Remembering them disrupts comfortable patriotism. It insists that courage does not always wear uniforms and that sacrifice does not require a foreign enemy. Sometimes, it occurs on familiar ground, under a clear sky, carried out by institutions meant to protect rather than destroy. The massacre exposed a system that functioned exactly as designed, even as it failed morally. Authority did not collapse in chaos. It operated efficiently, decisively, and without hesitation. Orders were followed. Procedures were invoked. Language was shaped to justify outcomes. This was not lawlessness, but selective lawfulness. The response to the march demonstrated how legality can be bent to protect power while criminalizing dissent. The police did not act outside the structure, they embodied it. That distinction matters because it shifts focus away from individual blame and towards systemic accountability. The violence was not a mistake corrected later. It was absorbed, defended, and normalized. Understanding this reframes the massacre as more than a historical tragedy. It becomes evidence of how institutions behave when economic interests feel threatened. The question is no longer whether injustice occurred, but how easily it was explained away, and how often similar explanations continue to succeed. The violence did not end when the gunfire stopped. It lingered in hospital rooms where survivors learned they might never work again. It followed families into courtrooms where justice felt procedural rather than moral. It settled into daily life as a constant reminder that truth does not guarantee consequence. Many survivors described the aftermath as a second injury, less visible, but just as damaging. Their experiences were questioned, minimized, reframed. Official narratives moved forward without them. Injustice, when sustained over time, becomes a form of endurance. Living with unacknowledged truth requires restraint, patience, and resilience that few are prepared for. Some survivors withdrew into silence. Others spoke relentlessly, knowing repetition was the only defense against erasure. Their persistence ensured the massacre remained a living issue rather than a closed case. It proved that harm does not require repetition to persist. Sometimes, it survives simply by being unresolved. History prefers conclusions. It favors moments where accountability arrives, lessons are learned, and balance is restored. The Memorial Day massacre offers none of that comfort. There was no decisive justice, no sweeping reform, no public reckoning proportional to the harm done. Instead, there was continuation. The same structures remained in place. The same inequalities endured. This lack of resolution is precisely what makes the story unsettling. It resists narrative closure. It forces viewers to sit with ambiguity, to acknowledge that some injustices are not corrected by time alone. Closure, in this case, would be artificial. The massacre did not end. It simply stopped being discussed loudly. Silence filled the space where accountability should have lived. That silence became instructive, revealing how societies move past trauma not by resolving it, but by stepping around it carefully, hoping distance will do what justice did not. In such cases, remembering becomes an act of defiance. To recall events accurately is to challenge narratives built on convenience and denial. Memory resists simplification. It refuses to turn violence into abstraction or victims into statistics. Remembering the massacre demands responsibility, not nostalgia. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about power, enforcement, and whose lives are considered expendable. This kind of memory is active rather than ceremonial. It does not settle quietly into monuments or anniversaries. It disrupts, questions, and persists. When people choose to remember honestly, they interrupt the cycle that allows similar violence to repeat. Forgetting is not passive. It is a choice shaped by comfort and distance. Memory, when maintained deliberately, becomes a form of protection, not only for the past, but for the future. The massacre raises a question that extends far beyond its time. Why did authority fear unarmed workers more than it valued human life? The answer lies in what those workers represented. Collective action threatened control. Visibility threatened silence. Demands threatened precedent. Violence became the response not because danger was present, but because change was possible. That dynamic remains visible wherever peaceful movements are met with disproportionate force. The Memorial Day massacre is not an anomaly. It is a pattern revealed early and clearly. It shows how fear operates upward, not downward, how institutions respond when power feels vulnerable. Recognizing that pattern is essential to disrupting it. Without recognition, history repeats with new names, new locations, and the same justifications. Rights are often described as guaranteed, but history shows they are conditional in practice. The massacre demonstrated how quickly constitutional promises dissolve when they conflict with economic and political interests. The right to assemble, to speak, to organize, all existed on paper. None were enforced when they mattered most. Understanding this fragility is critical. Rights do not defend themselves. They require vigilance, documentation, and collective insistence. The field where the marchers stood became proof that legality without enforcement is symbolic at best. The massacre teaches that protection is not automatic, and that assuming it exists can be dangerous. Awareness of that reality does not lead to despair. It leads to preparation. Today, the site of the massacre appears ordinary. Cars pass. Buildings stand. Grass grows where blood once soaked into the earth. That ordinariness is deceptive. It creates the illusion that nothing extraordinary ever happened there. But history does not disappear because it is paved over. It remains embedded in place, waiting for attention. Ordinary locations often hold the most unresolved truths. Recognizing them requires intention. Without it, spaces like this become invisible markers of ignored injustice, silently reinforcing the idea that time alone absolves harm. When stories like this fade from public memory, repetition becomes not just possible but predictable. Forgetting does not arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, disguised as progress, distraction, or exhaustion. Institutions grow comfortable when past violence is no longer discussed. Authority learns that time can dissolve outrage more effectively than accountability ever could. The conditions that allowed the massacre to happen, economic inequality, suppressed dissent, selective enforcement, do not disappear on their own. They wait. When memory weakens, warning signs lose urgency. Protest becomes inconvenience. Power becomes impatient. Violence becomes an option again. Remembering is therefore not an emotional exercise, but a preventative one. It interrupts the cycle that allows harm to repeat under new justifications. The Memorial Day massacre matters because it reveals how easily peace is overridden when silence replaces vigilance. Forgetting does not heal injustice. It prepares the ground for its return, often in forms that feel familiar only after it is too late to stop them. The Memorial Day massacre remains unfinished because its lessons are still contested rather than absorbed. The facts are clear, but their implications remain uncomfortable. Accepting them would require acknowledging that lawful authority can commit unjust violence and face no meaningful consequence. That truth disrupts faith in institutions designed to protect. As a result, the story is often softened, reframed, or reduced to context without responsibility. This resistance to full acknowledgement keeps the massacre unresolved. An unfinished history does not rest quietly. It exerts pressure, resurfacing whenever similar patterns appear. Each time peaceful demands are met with force, the echoes return. The massacre asks a question that has not been answered decisively. What safeguards exist when the enforcers of law become its violators? Until that question is confronted honestly, the story cannot close. Its unfinished nature is not a failure of memory, but a signal that accountability was deferred, not delivered. Every generation inherits this story with a choice attached to it. That choice is not whether the massacre matters, but how it will be treated. It can be background noise, acknowledged briefly, then set aside as irrelevant to the present. Or it can become responsibility, shaping how power is questioned and how dissent is protected. Neutrality is often presented as an option, but history shows it is not. Silence does not stand apart from injustice, it stabilizes it. When stories like this are met with indifference, authority learns that consequences expire with time. Choosing to remember actively disrupts that lesson. It tells future movements that history is watching, recording, and responding. Responsibility does not require constant outrage. It requires sustained awareness and refusal to accept convenient forgetting. What each generation does with that inheritance determines whether the massacre remains a warning or becomes a blueprint repeated under different names. This documentary does not ask viewers to feel briefly disturbed and then move on. It asks them to recognize patterns that persist beyond a single event. The Memorial Day massacre is not isolated by time. It is connected by structure. Whenever economic demands are dismissed as threats, whenever peaceful assembly is framed as disorder, the same logic reappears. Awareness is the purpose here, not spectacle. Understanding how violence is justified, normalized, and later minimized equips viewers to identify it, demonstrate again. This is not about assigning guilt to the past. It is about sharpening perception in the present. History becomes useful only when it changes how power is observed and challenged. Without that application, memory becomes ceremonial rather than protective. The massacre demands more than acknowledgement. It demands attention sustained long after the initial shock fades. Silence often disguises itself as neutrality, but once exposed, that disguise no longer holds. The massacre revealed how silence protected violence, before it occurred, during its execution, and long after its justification. Silence allowed orders to go unquestioned. Silence enabled narratives to replace truth. Silence absorbed outrage until it dissipated. Once that role is recognized, silence can no longer be defended as passive. It becomes an active force with measurable consequences. Breaking silence does not require shouting. It requires refusal to accept incomplete explanations and sanitized histories. It requires insisting that memory include responsibility. When silence is exposed for what it is, the balance shifts slightly. Power becomes visible. Justifications weaken. Accountability, while still difficult, becomes imaginable. That shift is small, but it is essential. Beneath ordinary ground lie extraordinary truths, unresolved and demanding attention. The field where the massacre occurred no longer announces its history. It looks safe, familiar, forgettable. That transformation is the final warning. Violence does not always leave visible scars on the landscape. Sometimes it leaves questions instead, questions buried beneath routine and progress. Remembering the Memorial Day massacre means refusing to let those questions remain buried. It means recognizing that history does not end when the noise stops. It continues in structures, attitudes, and choices. The story remains unfinished not because it lacks an ending, but because its meaning is still being negotiated. Whether it becomes a lesson that prevents future harm or a forgotten tragedy that enables repetition depends on what is done with it now. Ordinary places often hold the greatest responsibility. They wait quietly until someone chooses to remember.